Okay, hello.
Hello.
Fullerton. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background and where you from?
Well, my father was a doctor in the army. We came basically from Shropshire on one side of the family and from Yorkshire on the other. But basically we've been in and around sort of Wolverhampton, Shropshire area most of the time.
Okay, pure English roots. How did you end up working for the Foreign Office?
Well, I started my career in Shell International Petroleum Marketing in Uganda, but I really wanted to be in the Middle East. It did not seem to be going that way, so the Foreign Office offered more possibilities for that. So I did a change, and I'd also read Arabic and Persian at Cambridge University, so obviously the wish to go to the Middle East was natural following on from that.
Yeah, you just answered my next question about your education and where did you start?
I went to a boarding school at Cheltenham College in Gloucestershire, but then I went to Queen's College, Cambridge, after a gap of 2 years, wandering around Australia and the Far East. And I read, as I've said, Arabic and Persian, which was very hard work.
Oh, of course.
Sorry, could I just stop this?
Okay. Did you all gravitate towards Middle East appointments in the diplomatic service by luck of the draw or by personal preference and choice?
It's certainly by personal preference and choice. I mean, if you join the Foreign Office as an Arabist, as I did, they sent me to the school we had then called MICAS, Middle East Centre for Arab Studies, up above Beirut in the hills. And one became a Foreign Office Arabist, as it were, which didn't mean you were only in the Arab world by any means, but it did mean that you were obviously going to go that direction, and I was very happy with that.
Oh, of course. You were ambassador from the UK to Kuwait. Can you tell us a bit about how all that went, and was it war during the time of conflict of the Gulf?
It was immediately after the war, and the clear-up had gone pretty well. The Kuwaitis worked very hard and spent a huge amount of money to clear away all that mess and disaster that they'd faced, and they did very well at that. So they were very friendly towards us, of course, and we had a long British relationship with Kuwait going way back, of course. And many Kuwaitis have property in London. Many of them said, London is our second home. There was a lot of toing and froing.
Mm-hmm.
So the atmosphere was very warm and very friendly towards us, and we to them. It was a very enjoyable place, a posting to be, though of course the ravages of the war were still evident. But they'd done so much to repair it.
Of course. Can I ask you, where do you think British politicians, especially government members and ministers, have a chance to learn about foreign policy? Or do they have opportunity to learn it from Foreign Office professional staff?
They have opportunity if they'll take it. Some do, some don't. I mean, members of Parliament coming to places I've been in are usually interested, of course, otherwise I wouldn't go. Sometimes they come with preconceived ideas. They have opportunity. There are organisations like Chatham House, there are lots of bilateral societies in Britain which they can learn about the Middle East if they want to do so. The opportunities are there, and certainly the Foreign Office will always be helpful to brief them if they ask for it and if they're interested.
All right. You played a role in the famous collective letter of dismay sent by retired diplomats and Foreign Office experts to the Prime Minister then, Tony Blair, on lamenting his decision to invade Iraq. Can you please tell us about the background of this letter and the impact it had?
Well, the start of it came from a man called Oliver Miles, a retired British ambassador, who takes a very keen interest in the Middle East and is very knowledgeable about it. And he started the ball rolling. And then a lot of other people, many by no means just involved with the Middle East, but from all kinds of spheres outside, came in and signed too. Obviously, we were saying something we felt deeply. Was the point of doing it.
Yes,
we didn't get a proper answer from Mr. Blair.
But many people
it had an impact. It was widely read. I mean, the New York Review covered it in full, and the Independent had it on the front page. And a lot of people have come to me and said they've heard about it. And I got some letters from people I'd never at all saying how glad they were that we'd spoken out in that way. So it did have an impact, and it hasn't been forgotten. People still refer to it.
Oh, that's good. Why did you feel that USA and the UK were wrong to invade Iraq? And was it a moral or political or legal issue for you personally?
It was moral, legal and political, all of those, that it was wrong to go into Iraq. The whole premise was false. I think Wolfowitz, wasn't he the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time, actually admitted at some point that the weapons of mass destruction was a pretext. They would do it anyway, and that's how it appeared. So it seemed to me the case not proven. They didn't give Mr. Blix enough time to go on looking for the weapons, which turned out not to be there. It always seemed improbable to me that Iraq was a major danger to anybody outside its own citizens. That was quite obvious, I thought. We'd been told by Madame Albright and the British Foreign Office and lots of other people that said it was harmless, that he was in a box, that the sanctions were working, that he couldn't do anything to anybody. Then all of a sudden along comes Mr. Bush and it's all different.
Yes.
It was completely unconvincing on every ground, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. In the context of the wider search for peace in the Middle East, how important do you think solving the Israel-Palestine problem is right now?
I think it's absolutely essential. It's not, of course, the only thing causing trouble in the world in that area by any means, but it's a very important issue, and it's a constant, like an ulcer, I think. That is an irritant that's always there, and the injustice that's perceived around the world, Islamic countries and other places too, which goes on and on and on. The UN resolutions are produced against it. International law speaks against it. The International Court speaks against the wall, for example, and nothing happens. So I think it's an irritant. It's something that extremists can latch onto and point to and feel themselves strongly stirred by. So yes, it's a very important issue, I think.
What did you do in your time as a diplomat to try to help solve the Israel-Palestine problem, and what was being done in general around you? Can you tell us, please?
Well, when you are in the service, you can't speak publicly or take public stance, obviously.
Yes, we know.
But within the service, obviously, you send reports back to the Foreign Office, reporting the views of the people in the country you're in, and giving your own views and saying you're quite free to say what you think should be done, and you do. So one does all that, but one can't have a public, obviously. I mean, one doesn't write to one's MP about that issue. You can write to him about other issues, but ones you're totally involved in, you tend not to. Once you're out of the service, you can.
Of course, you understand it. Do you think the policies pursued by President George Bush have been a help or hindrance to the wider search for peace and reconciliation in the Middle East, and to why?
Well, I think disastrous would be probably the most effective word for his policies. I mean, they're completely wrong. I think they seem to have come from, well, I'm not sure where they've come from, but from a very right-wing sort of series of neocons or whatever. And they've been illogical. They've seemed to show no knowledge or experience of the history of imperialism or the world or colonialism or what happens when you invade people. What about Vietnam? All these things seem to have been overridden by some theories, the motives of which are rather dubious to my mind.
Yes, I personally agree with you. If you could wave a magic wand and grant 3 wishes to the people of Middle East to help advance peace and reconciliation, what should they wish for and why?
Well, I think one thing I would wish for would be a better understanding in the United States of exactly what's happening in the Middle East and how. That, I think, would be very important. Another wish would be that the Palestinians themselves could get their act together, so that Hamas and Fatah and so on, they didn't have this constant battle that's going on. And I think then, well, what else can I wish for them? If you hold on a second, I did write something else down here. If I can put it. Where was the question? I'm sorry about that. Yes, okay. And I would say the other thing that there must be some movement within Israel too. The Palestinians have to get their act together, but the Israelis, we can't have this wall. Something must happen about settlements if you're going to have any sort of solution on the lines the Quartet and other people want to pursue. So there are 3 things really. Better understanding in America, the reality of the situation, and less one-sided lobbying. The Palestinians getting their act together and being able to work to a moderate strategy. And the withdrawal of the Israeli hardline attitude and settlements in the wall. I mean, all of these things will be difficult to achieve, but they are to be wished for.
Oh, well, I like these wishes. What are your views of on the religions aspect of peace and reconciliation? Can be great monotheist religions learn to live together in harmony, and is it any obstacles on the way? What do you
I think they can do, and obviously the more liberal minded people in all those religions do. You have examples in this country and elsewhere where the three faiths get together and cooperate and do good things. You do it.
Yeah.
But of course there are a lot of people who don't, from all sides. I mean, the religious right in America is fairly amazing, I think, as generally thought so. And then you have Islamic extremists and Israeli extremists and so on. Where you get that, of course, religion doesn't help at all. It tends to divide. But where members of those faiths perhaps adhere to the original beliefs of those faiths and work together, it can be a powerful force for good, yes. And it does work in places.
What do you feel the long-term role of education and scholarship in the creating the conditions for peace and reconciliation? And do you think how well academic students and teachers currently undertake that work?
Well, it has a role, obviously. The more education and scholarship and learning people can do and broaden their minds about this issue, the better it should be. There are academic contexts. There has been an academic boycott of Israel in some parts from British academics, which may not be very helpful because one imagines that a lot of Israeli academics are probably on the more liberal side of things anyway. I just don't know enough about that. But yes, the answer to the question is that scholarships and education and learning more has to be a good thing. Providing, of course, they're not coming from extreme extreme ends.
Yes, of course. Well, I want to come back to that letter. The list of people who signed that famous letter, along with you, is very impressive, including people such like Graham Hughes, former ambassador of Egypt, Terence Clark, former ambassador in Iraq, Francis Cornish, former ambassador in Israel, Sir James Craig, former ambassador of Arabia. Do you remain in touch with any of them? And do you ever meet socially to discuss peace and reconciliation issues? And where do people of this intellectual eminence go where they retire?
Well, to start at the back first, I mean, they do a lot of things. Some of them are masters or presidents of Oxford or Cambridge colleges. A number have done that. Some have other kinds of academic career. Some go into business as consultants, or they take part as a businessman abroad. Others lecture on intellectual cruises and go around various parts of the world. Some are in business itself. So they do a variety of things, really. Am I in touch with them? Yes, some of them, certainly, by email or phone or letter, and sometimes meeting too, yes. So, yes, I am in touch with some of them.
Oh, well, that is cool. If the high-level Peace Institute in London, funded by a fixed percentage of the NLMID budget, would this be a useful and intelligent forum for policy, research, debate and analysis, do you think?
It could be. In a sense, you have institutions that aim to do that. You have Royal United Services Institute, you have Chatham House, you have places like that do offer venues for that kind of discussion. But if the MOD were to fund one, as long as it was open for all kinds of people and was broad-minded and took on board what was said, I can't see it being a bad thing, no. So, yes, it could be that. But there are places where that can happen.
Well, the work of the TRCME is complex and ongoing. We are planning and hoping to go back to Israel, Palestine and Egypt next year, and subsequently to other neighboring countries such as Jordan, Lebanon and Syria. Do you know any colleagues from whom you might interview in these countries and would be useful to say things about peace and reconciliation for us, either in the British Foreign Office or among the local actors and academics?
I do know the present ambassador in Syria and Jordan, for example. But the ambassadors do change around, every 3 or 4 years. They tend to move on. So, and I went to the Foreign Office the other day and talked to the director of Middle East, North Africa. So, I mean, you could go to the Foreign Office, obviously, and talk to the centre, as it were. But any of these ambassadors, I imagine, would be amenable to discussing things with you in their patch, just as they would with a newspaper reporter or whoever. So it's worth going to see them, certainly, and talking to them.
Okay. One of the other aims of campaign of our institute is to establish a European Union mediation service. Do you think it's a good idea?
I think the EU could play more of a role than it does, and I've urged, sometimes I write to my MEP suggesting this, and I usually get a fairly sympathetic response. I don't like the way people tend to sort of hide behind American coattails and say only America can do anything about the Middle East. To me, that's not really right. So I think the Europeans could be more involved and should be.
Can you define, please, for us, the qualities that make the excellent diplomat, and how would you define diplomacy itself?
Well, diplomacy is really like oiling the wheels to get a machine to go well between different countries. Just as people buy and sell things and have quarrels and play games with each other and all this, countries do that. But diplomats tend to be the mechanism by which this can be done between countries, because the country itself obviously can't, in an entity like that. So they try and produce good relations where possible. They explain each other's views to each other in different countries, transmit them, comment on them, keep their country as well informed as possible about what's happening in another country, and vice versa. And you need a lot of patience, you need tolerance, you need to be able to express yourself, to get on with people, and to have an open mind, all those things, and to tell the truth.
Oh yes, truth is the main thing. And do you think peace is best advanced by diplomacy, or by education, or by militaries? What would be your view on that?
Well, I think militarism is a last resort, obviously, to a situation. If you look at World War II or something like that, you could say all else seemed to have failed. But obviously diplomacy and negotiation must be the preferred way of doing things, and you take those as far as you possibly can. They do, it's generally conceded that militarism becomes an answer when diplomacy has failed, but you don't want it to fail. You must try those two to the hilt. We've seen militarism, and it may seem sometimes to have an immediate effect or to work in the short term,
Yes.
but the longer term, well, Iraq is a good example. Iraq was conquered very fast, and some people said, it's marvellous, look, we've got rid of a dictator and so on. But what's happened thereafter?
No, we heard results.
Right, and there are a lot of examples around the world where a military effort has had some instant success, but what comes after is something else.
Do you feel optimistic about the state of the world?
Not very, no.
Oh.
I'm afraid, I wish I could, and I think there's always some hope, and as long as people come out of the woodwork with liberal, helpful ideas, and manage to get on with together, and those people take prominence over some more less attractive factions, then there's more hope. But I don't feel very optimistic the way things are going, I must say. There's so many problems before us.
I would like to ask you, in the wake of the Mumbai killings and the problem of Kashmir, can you see any hope to peace in that region, and what can diplomats do?
Well, there must always be hope in that region. There are advances. It goes backwards and forwards, rather. Sometimes it all goes downhill over the Kashmir, and sometimes it is better. The Mumbai killings are obviously not at all a help, and a very sad and awful event. I did spend 3 years in Pakistan, and I went all around the northwest frontier province with a heavy armed militia escort, as you had to do, because it's a fairly rugged place, to say the least. And I think that's all a very sorry mess too, and a very tragic one. The answer diplomats can do is what they should be doing, is to broaden understanding of what the reality of the situation is, and to try and help parties come together, and to make sure that people understand in their own country what's really going on where they are. and to work towards that. So I think, yes, there must be some hope. We can never give up hope on that region. But Pakistan and India, there are two huge populations. And India, too, is a very volatile country. I mean, you can go from peace and quiet and charming situation to a riot in quite a short time, as in some other places. But yes, one has to be hopeful. There are a lot of well, it may help, but there are a lot of very intelligent people around, in those countries, so one hopes somehow for a solution.
In the work of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, it is our belief that by bringing all parties together to tell their stories and to share their visions of peace, that they can help advance in long-term peace settlement in this region. Britain has been historically involved in this region for centuries. If you could have an air of the next Prime Minister of Britain to lay down a long-term peace policy, what could help restore normality in the region? What advice would you give?
Well, I would say you have to work very hard for the Middle East peace in Palestine, Israel. That's one thing. We all acknowledge that Israel has to be safe and secure, but Palestine also has to have a real life and a viable state under the current thinking. I mean, maybe some other solution, but I don't know what it could be. There are various ideas around. So I would say you've got to work for that. I would say encourage European activity as well. Don't just follow American thinking. Have a policy of our own and think it out and follow it. And I think it's as I say, that central Palestine-Israel situation seems crucial to me, and I think I would urge very strongly that be done. I would then say beware of any more military adventures like Iraq, and make quite sure you don't get involved in those. And work to see that you really understand more deeply what's happening and that the people around you do, and that you take qualified advice from all kinds of sources, which Mr. Blair did not seem to do. He didn't seem, appearances were that he didn't seem to want to know. I mean, we had that huge demonstration in London before the Iraq War, yes, 1 million people or more. Yeah. We had all kinds of other voices, like our own letter, but they didn't seem to be taken on board. Ignored. Right, so I would say that prime ministers who are very busy people, and we tend to live in sound bites now, and everything has to be on one side of a sheet of paper, or they don't have time to read it. And that's not depth. I mean, a prime minister inevitably isn't going to know much about, unless he's got some Middle East background, about the 1920s in Iraq and the British occupation of those days. But he should do, if he's formulating policy, he should have an idea of what happened before. Yes. So I would say that he's got to take the time out to listen to some serious academic or whatever, people who say, look, do you know about all this background? And think about that too. So we need more depth, I think.
Many thanks for your patience and for your thoughts on these matters.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you
hope
very
it
much.
contributes something. Is that all right?
Yes.